Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another edition of Lunchtime Live with Start Art History at Masterpiece 2022. And today, we have the singular pleasure and honor of joining Lady Carnarvon to talk to us about collecting, about the legacy of Highclere Castle and what it is that interests her. So, Lady Carnarvon, first and foremost, thank you for joining us.
Pleasure.
What excites you as a collector?
Well, I think, as you all might know, that this is the centenary of the discovery of Tutankhamun. Mm-hmm. And the 5th Earl of Carnarvon probably had one of the most outstanding collection of Egyptian antiquities in the world, which he had built up from 1907 until his death in 1923. So that is perhaps where my husband Geordie and I tend to focus, mm-hmm. and to which we tend to add a little as we can. It's a challenging area, given provenance, and to make sure you know where it's all come from.
Of course.
But of course, his collection was sold to pay death duties in 1924, and it was sent off to New York in 1926. And America had the money, and Howard Carter helped Lady Carnarvon pack off 1,400 of the most priceless and beautiful objects from Highclere to the Met. And what was left at Highclere was a few unexciting objects, apparently. We think they're pretty cool.
I
and they were stuffed away in cupboards and found again. So in terms of collecting, finding, and treasures, that's quite an interesting story, because the treasures and the secrets of Highclere Castle kind of all come together in that particular unique and discreet collection, if you like. But like any stately home, Highclere is a stately home which showcases the art or the desire or the passion for collecting over the centuries. Do you know how old Highclere is?
I don't off the top of my head. Is it 16th century?
Do anybody here know? Well, there's been a home there for 1,200 years. So that's how old I am.
Is it,
I feel. But,
the collection, how old the collection is.
But so there aren't that many items. So the antiquity of the home lies in its architecture, if you like, mm-hmm. and the bricks and the stones which frame the lives of the people who've lived there for at least 1,200 years.
Of course.
And then as you move forward, much of what's contained in the castle probably dates from 1679, because Highclere was owned by the bishops of Winchester, the church, for 800 years, and then my husband's family since 1679. So that was really when I feel like the first books and the first works of art, masterpieces, began to come into the castle and stay there. Many of William of Wykeham, for example, who lived here as Bishop of Winchester, mm-hmm. an extraordinary man, he left many of his works of art to New College, Oxford, or Winchester College, or Winchester Cathedral. So that's where they are. So I've gone to have a look there. Amazing.
It's so cool. I mean, so much of the legacy of British art history, which obviously it goes back, as far as you'd like, back to the Romans. But if we're going to think in terms of fine art and painting, the 17th century, the mid-17th century is really when British art history enters into its own. And so there's this interesting overlap between the history of Highclere and its collection, or its painting collection, and the history of British art as well. And one of the things that I've always found so unique about British art conservation and British art history compared to other European countries or the United States, where I'm from, is that in this country there's this amazing tradition of the country house that has these remarkable capsule collections. And we were chatting earlier, and you were being quite modest about the collection at Highclere. I mean, it is pretty remarkable, actually. But for you, as the mistress of Highclere, to command these Van Dycks and these Rubens, these Reynolds paintings. I mean, what do you hope to, you as an individual, is there anything you hope to add to that, or do you see yourself more as a custodian of that collection?
Of the paintings? No, we do. We do buy some paintings back, like any stately home. We've all fought to survive, and it's blooming amazing we're still here, frankly. So things have been sold over the centuries, and sometimes something comes up, and it depends whether we've got the funds or not. At the moment, the answer would be not to buy things back. But that is one point. So we've just bought back a painting of Lady Evelyn Herbert, who with her father went into the tomb of Tutankhamun by Alban, which was a lovely thing to have back. It's quite frustrating you're buying things back which were actually hanging there. So it is kind of irritating as well, because it's this balance between capital and revenue. And, it's so worthwhile understanding that. And once you've lost the capital, it's very hard to get it back.
Well, quite.
So, which is reflected in the collection of paintings as well as the home. So we tend to buy things connected with Highclere because in the end, I'm telling stories, hopefully truthful ones in this case, but I'm telling stories about the people, the lives, the laughter of those people who've lived at Highclere. And that's reflected in the art. So that's where I think my impetus comes from.
Right.
My husband loves collecting. It's definitely in the blood, and so does my son. He was given some money from a godmother to buy something or other, and he's gone out and bought a painting, which he said was not what she'd given him the money for. But actually, I'm really interested that that's what he actually bought. So he's got to go and apologise to her. I think she was giving him the money for a holiday or something, but he's gone and bought a painting.
He spent it well. He spent it well if he bought a painting.
Really interesting, actually, how it some of the desire to collect is both nurture and nature. So we're back to Shakespeare again.
Absolutely. Well, it's really a fascinating thing to have this conversation here at Masterpiece, because obviously there's a massive cultural remit for the fair, and there's an educational program and all these other things. But I mean, ultimately, all of these stalls are here to sell us things. Fundamentally, sure, it's commerce, at the end of the day. And it's something that I find really interesting about British art history and about how we think about how we show and talk about works of art from the past of this country. And again, Highclere is so closely bound up with that, particularly in the context of the legacy of ancient Egypt, of Britain and Egypt, and of course, Carnarvon and Carter's discoveries. So what's it like for you living with the works? I know that a fair few of the works have gone, I believe, to the Met, if memory serves.
No, I mean, the 1,400 items of the Fifth Earls collection, the bulk of it was sold to the Met in 1924.
This is, of course, yeah.
So that was then, and they've stayed there, and they formed the heart of the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of its Egyptology. They were bought by an amazing man called Edward Harkness, who's also very interesting in his own right and part of the Gilded Age. I've just come back from Newport, Rhode Island, so it was interesting to be able to bring him into that particular talk as well, because he was a very interesting man. He was out there in Egypt at the point of discovery of the tomb, and Lord Carnarvon had met him, but it was only after his death that he did that. So that was a huge bequest and a way of showcasing some of the most finely crafted, often very small, works of art of ancient Egypt. You can tell the Fifth Earl of Carnarvon's eye whenever you go around the Metropolitan. You can get your eye in without looking at the labels. You know which one
I completely agree with you on that. It actually is really interesting to me the way that the Carnarvon collection is curated in the Met, because obviously the Met is a museum really unlike any here in London, in that there's a connection to be made there between old master and modern fine art and antiquities as well, which is something we don't do so much here in London. But one of the things that the Met does, I think, spectacularly with the collection is allow the pieces to exist within their own history, as well as being a part of British history as well, which they very much are, but also at the same time using them as a reference point for so many jumping off points in modern art as well, which is something that a lot of museums like, say, the Louvre or the British Museum aren't in a position to do. Not that they don't wish to, but that they're not in a position because that's not their remit to do. So it's so cool to me thinking about that collection in New York and what remains of it in Highclere as well, because it fires off in so many different directions, because it gives us this. I mean, obviously there's the sort of celebrity status of Tutankhamun, and that's the Egyptian that everyone can name. That's the one everyone knows, King Tut. But also understanding that work not just in regards to the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb, but more the sort of rediscovery by the early moderns of ancient Egyptian aesthetics, is so influential on the development of modern art and abstraction in particular.
There's one particular piece in the mat, which is a jasper fragment of Nefertiti's face. It's just the lower part and her lips and her face. It could be in MoMA, the Met, the British Museum. It could be in a modern contemporary art piece. It's one of my favorite in the world, including the Tomb of Tutankhamun. I just think it transcends time and space. So it is incredibly interesting. And again, that was Lord Carnarvon's eye. He was both excavating, finding, and buying. And in 1922, 23, he'd actually bought 2 more pieces in, I think, Cairo, which he'd brought back to have mounted. And it's the tiny stories of how his care to have them mounted. It's a prancing horse. And I've forgotten what the other piece was, but his care of having them mounted and where he wanted to position them. So he turned what was the breakfast room in Highclere in 1909 to his antiquity room. He'd had a really bad car crash, and he was in situ, and he wanted to spend some time, looking at the pieces, researching them. And he was able to ask all the great, because of who he was, all the great scholars of the time to Highclere, from Francis Griffiths to Le Grand to Spiegelberg, as well, obviously Howard Carter, Herbert Winlock, Joe Lyndon Smith, all the different people you've read about, all stayed at Highclere. So it's so interesting reading the visitors' books. I've just finished and copy edited, thanks be to God, the Earl and the Pharaoh, a book, because no one's ever written his biography, and I've so enjoyed it. So I've become far better versed in the man himself, who's most unexpected, and I've really enjoyed writing it. So I have got more to grips with the breadth of his collection.
That's fascinating. Has there never been a biography written about the Pharaoh?
No. And I was going back to first resources. I can't tell you. I turned a room on the top floor of the castle into, which was called Orient, so I thought, that's my room. Painted it yellows, because that's the colour of Egypt. And actually I used some teals. Anyway, I had some fun doing that. And it is covered, the floor is covered. So any burglar couldn't find anything in it anyway. With all my papers, I ended up going back to so many first sources and reading papers, and it was a really horrendous deadline and timeline, which I just about met. And then having sent it off, I'm afraid, lay down to all the papers and cried because I was so tired. But I did do it because I thought it was really important to do, because this was the man, he had the concession in the Valley of the Kings. He knew about, the papers of Gaston Maspero and Theodore Davis.
Absolutely.
And he knew what he was looking for. So very interesting. So that was one part of collecting in Highclere. But if you take the Egyptian collection away, you'd still have quite a strong collection of paintings and other works.
Oh, I agree. Well. I mean, 18th century Grand Manner portraits, early 19th century works. I mean, it is a
not
great,
bad.
It's not bad. No, you could do worse. Yeah, it's pretty good. Pretty good collection to live with. It must be said. But I mean, but the Egyptian thing is quite fascinating, because for a number of reasons, and I'd be curious to know like why you think this might be the case, given you sort of live with so much of this and live with this legacy. The works that were uncovered by Carnarvon and Carter, the legacy of which is being displayed here at Masterpiece this year, has a universal appeal that, for whatever reason, as opposed to Mesopotamia or other areas of the Maghreb,
Leonard
take your
Woolley
pick,
was also quite a frequent visitor at Highclere, funnily enough. So, and he was, and he also worked out at Tel Al-Mana. So, but yes, it has far more appeal than that. But I think all the visitors in Roman times wanted to go and visit the Valley of the Kings and the pyramids in Egypt.
This is it.
It's held such a fascination.
I've always wondered why that is. Actually, again, this is something I don't know that our listeners would be aware of. Is that actually I wrote my doctoral dissertation on Western artists, specifically British artists, looking at ancient Egypt, or the remains of ancient Egypt in the 19th and early 20th centuries, and it's something that I've found endlessly fascinating in my research. My conclusion was that part of the interest, particularly amongst like Victorians, so slightly before the fifth Earl and Carter, but still they're working within that trajectory, was this idea of an eternal culture, rightly or wrongly, an eternal culture that had been sort of rather romantically weathered by the sands of time, but still existed and still had a kind of currency, something that in the work of artists like the Scottish painter David Roberts speaks to this idea that there is a vibrancy still in the legacy of ancient Egypt that I find endlessly fascinating. And I remember, actually this is a personal note, but as a child, studying ancient Egypt, learning about 1922 and Carter and Carnarvon, just thinking that it must have been such an amazing thing to, this is so corny, please forgive me, but that I remember thinking as a child of, imagine opening the tomb and breathing the air of
No,
that,
thank
you
you.
know. That
was about
I thought it was
frankly.
great. You know, I thought, cool, this must have been amazing. I said they're probably choking, you know, on this dead air. It's true, but it is a fascinating idea to me that you know that your family provides this link.
I think it also came after the tragedy of World War One. You know,
Yes.
we'd had 4 years of horrendous tragedy. We were the world went into recession, very unstable, very brittle, forming new parts of Europe. There's been the flu of 1919, and then you had this glimpse of all the glints of gold into a pharaonic world, which had lasted 5,000 years. So it rather sounds familiar, so maybe we're due to find another tomb. But anyway, I hope we're moving on. But it is a very brittle and frightening world. And I think by looking back into something like this, it gives you an anchor of the past. And again, hope, because of the finely crafted works of art, because they've withstood the sands of time,
Very much.
that looking backwards helps us sometimes find our feet in order to look forwards. And it was that moment in 22 when everybody was interested. And, you know, Lord Carnarvon was writing in his diaries that from taxi drivers to people working on the farm to King George V and Queen Mary, to whom he went for an hour to have an audience with them in December 1922, to school children in America, South Africa, Japan. It was all flooded with wanting a little bit of this world of treasure and secrets. So it did resonate, and he was
Absolutely.
almost as mystified as I am trying to sometimes explain it. But it was extraordinary excitement. It's the Rider Haggard, it's the Indiana Jones. And he was kind of like an Indiana Jones figure with his
I think that's
hat
apt.
and his headband and
Sure.
his love of fast cars and his speeding tickets, going 25 miles an hour through Newbury. And he didn't stop when the policeman put his hand up. So there's all those funny bits. And he had quite a good sense of humour. But it was... he's been a fun man to get to know.
I love it, and it still
And it's
resonates.
just
You know,
yeah.
Through world tours over the course of my lifetime of the treasures, and of course their current location. You know, their now permanent location in of the treasures, some of the treasures in Egypt, and the global excitement in not just its legacy as ancient stuff or its inspiration for subsequent artistic developments, but just as this moment in time, which, as you say, like the visual culture of ancient Egypt is unique in the ancient Mediterranean world, in that it's so consistent with a handful of exceptions. It's pretty samey, you know. And in fact, as I'm sure you know, King Tutankhamun's rule represents a return to normalcy from the previous dynasty, the previous period, I should say, the previous reign, that is so upsetting to...
Well, I sort of think of Akhenaten, to whom you're referring, as sort of the Egyptian version of how I explained it, of Henry VIII, because he actually wanted all the tribute and all the money to come to him, you know, instead of the Pope or the priests in his time. So he moved his capital, directed everything to him, and then at the end of his reign, which we had again the same upsets in this country, the priests moved in. They had a young pharaoh, 9 years old, and they said, "Excuse me, we're going to move back to Thebes and Luxor."
That's right.
So it's the easiest way to explain it. And Henry VIII again was a powerful, innovative king who was basically pretty narcissistic and focused on himself and his own pleasures, which he did to a remarkable degree, and so did Akhenaten. He had a beautiful wife, children, built Tel Al-Mana, and had quite a lot of fun. And that was
so I gather. That's such a cool way of thinking of it. Sorry, I'm sorry. I've never heard that before.
It's because I'm not a trained archaeologist.
No, I love
so
it.
try to
No,
explain it in
you're
different ways.
bang on. For those of you who are with us today who aren't as familiar with this as you might be, the predecessor to Tutankhamun, Akhenaten, was a pharaoh who spectacularly upended the entire cosmology of the ancient Egyptian world, effectively removing and indeed hoping to remove from future history the pantheon of Egyptian gods to replace with a single sun god, Aten, to which he was essentially the tributary to recreate the entirety of Egyptian society around his own patron deity, which again, as soon as he dies, everyone changed their mind.
Well, he didn't have
you
as
know?
many processions and fun as the old priests, actually.
No, it wasn't
and
as good a
part of
time.
Egyptian and culture and procession and religion is about the processions, it's the days off, it's the feast days. You know, and that's still with us today. So I sort of really enjoy explaining it in those terms. You know, we have Christmas and Easter and days off, which have religious and Christian meaning if you wish to go along that route. I, for one, do, but apart from that, it's also time off from the everyday life. So that's what the other priests went back to more successfully. They had more holidays, frankly.
This is exactly what Akhenaten wanted to get away from, which is quite frustrating. Which again is actually part of the brilliance of the Tutankhamun discovery, is this unrivaled visual record of what happens when a society kind of corrects for itself, you know, and goes back to the way it was before, which is so fascinating.
And the fifth Earl of Carnarvon, with his collection, was fascinated by the 18th dynasty works of art. He recognized in that the highest point of Egyptian works of art, and that's really where his collection was focused. So he was always particularly interested in that. Howard Carter did some of the wheeler-dealering, but he knew all the basic dealers in Egypt and Luxor himself as well. So he was always looking for the right price for what he was finding and bringing back. Again, with proper licenses at the time, he did things, thankfully, as properly as he was required to do at the time. And in terms of the excavation. And then, of course, that then led to a whole new challenge in terms of who had what rights to the discovery of the tomb of Tutankhamun. But it obviously fell to the Cairo Museum, and in the papers, that's where he thought everything was going.
Correct.
But it was the Daily Mail in particular spun stories in other directions. So it's again that nascent media frenzy of miscommunication, which I think we're there. We recognise that today.
Well, even to the point of any number of media organizations in this country, you know, pumping up the idea of the Tutankhamun curse. You know, this kind of, you know, this bananas stuff that my understanding of the expedition, and again, I'd be very happy to comment otherwise if I believed it to be the case, is that everything was handled well within the boundaries of legality and morality according to the strictures of the time, as far as I'm aware.
He had a concession to excavate, and actually he negotiated a very good concession to excavate, which in later date was more restrictive, and the concessions to excavate in somewhere like the Valley of the Kings was after the period in which he had gained the concession, only handed to academic institutions.
Of course.
So he was one of the last. He gained the concession to excavate from Professor Maspero because Carnarvon had demonstrated by his care, recording, publication of his previous finds that he was a fit and able person so to do. So he'd set out his stall and on that basis gone forward, and then he'd gained the concession in 1914, when, of course, the world went into war. But he went out in 1915. It's extraordinary when we know what was going on in France, and yet small things did continue. It's again a fascinating insight. Carnarvon, which is from a point of view of masterpieces quite interesting, married an extraordinary woman called Almina. She was the illegitimate daughter of Alfred de Rothschild, one of the most spectacular collectors of 18th century French art and furniture of his time. and obviously spectacularly wealthy. So Lord Carnarvon had followed an adage of Jane Austen that whilst you shouldn't marry for money, it'd be unwise to marry without money. So that's what he did. And the dowry was something like £50 million in today's terms. So that was his background, and he was very fond of his father-in-law. They got on very well. And, you know, one of his wife's wedding presents to Carnarvon was some beautiful Princeton engravings. So they collected in many different ways, and they were both influenced by Alfred de Rothschild. So some of his collections is still at Highclere today in terms of mice and china. So it was very much a world and a home in which they were. Lord Carnarvon was always looking for that which is perfect, or there must be something more perfect or more highly crafted. And that's something which drove the restlessness of his collecting. I mean, it was an extraordinary procession to watch. But Alfred was very influential in his world.
Of course, you know, it's as well as you say about it's a matter of family, of heritage, of sharing, of a spirit of generosity, which you've maintained to this day. If I may say, as an historian, your books are outstanding. I've read them all. So just as we wrap things up, Lady Carnarvon, what do you want your readers to take away from the books that you write about the seasons at Highclere, about Christmas at Highclere, about life in this rather unusual world? We're deliberately avoiding mentioning any television shows.
Oh, called Downton Abbey. Well, actually, there's a funny thing, because do you remember, have any of you seen Downton Abbey? Some of you.
I would imagine, yes.
There was a scene in Downton Abbey when they'd opened the house to the public, and the family pretended not to know any of the works of art on the wall. Do you remember that at all? They were completely ignorant. They had to be completely ignorant because I refused to let them pretend that the people on the walls were not people who didn't actually exist. So I said, you can't do that, and you can't pretend they're Lord Bloody Grantham, because they're not. They're real people who really did do things. They really collected. They really existed. They really lived. So that was that. So as people come round the house, I hope they'll interpret through the works of art the lives of the people who are represented in those works of art in different ways. There's two works of art perhaps to mention. One is the great Van Dyck of King Charles I on horseback from 1633, Superb. Which is in the dining room. It is the most extraordinary painting, and of course I can sit in there, and the most amazing thing is having breakfast, scrambled egg, underneath the Van Dyck. It is sort of surreal.
How dare you?
Actually, I hope he did. But it is. It's those funny moments in time which are surreal. It is the most amazing painting. People do come and see it. It represents a moment in his life, the divine right of king, which was to be shattered some, 15 years later. That painting was actually taken down in the time of Cromwell, and it was rolled up and it propped up a barn door. Did you know that?
I did not know that.
And it was then unfurled up and stuck up on the wall again. So that was a practical approach to making sure the painting continued to exist. And there's another work of art which is, there is perhaps one more to mention, which is the desk of Napoleon Bonaparte, which is by Jacob Frère, and a chair by Jacob Frère, which sits in one of our rooms, which is also an extraordinary piece of furniture to think that Napoleon Bonaparte sat at the desk. It's got some scratch marks on the arms of the chair. My father always said it was when he was scratching it before Waterloo, which I'm sure he wasn't. And it's got underneath the arm 1802, so he was consul, not emperor. It's those tiny details that I really like. And the third thing to mention is that in the saloon of the Great Hall in Downton Abbey, the saloon Le Salon in Highclere, there's an extraordinary leather wall covering which dates from 1661 from Cordoba in Spain. It was probably brought back by the second Earl of Carnarvon, or possibly the third, and it's in squares, so we can date it. There's a small piece in the Rijksmuseum, in Rijksmuseum Amsterdam. This covers an entire room, and there's another room on the top floor in the archive room, which is again covered in a gold version. But this is an amazing work of art, but it's a wall covering. And, it's 450 odd years old. My maths isn't very good, I'm an accountant. So that is also something which you almost pass by but it is something to wonder and admire. And today, obviously, Historic England would be absolutely furious if you dared cut up the top to make it fit, which obviously the third Earl of Carnarvon
Very much did, yeah. Yeah, 100%.
So it's extraordinary how it's living, working, enjoying, sharing, encouraging other people to buy, to look. Look at the craftsmanship of some of the carved wooden furniture, which we're no longer necessarily always appreciating. But it is a fascinating house in which to live.
Oh, it's an intriguing and beautiful home. I envy you that. Now, there's for those of you who are not able today or this week to make it to Highclere, there is an outstanding installation here at Masterpiece about the centenary of the 1922 discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. And if you don't mind me plugging you for just a moment, Lady Carnarvon has the most fascinating podcast, which I would strongly recommend. Well, I listen to it regularly, actually, which I would strongly recommend checking out. Of course, always seasonal opening at the castle. As well, in order to see some of the masterpieces on display there. And as for us, you can always find us at startarthistory.com or on Instagram as well, Start Art History. Lady Carnarvon, thank you so much for joining us today. It's an absolute joy. Thank you so much. And we'll see you all again very soon. Take care.
Thank you. No, it would just have been the... Well, now it's slightly different because, I don't know whether you know, but the Labour government, it was a Labour government, brought in a really strong piece of legislation in the 1980s, whereby that if the house and estate or the designated estate is deemed of national importance, when an earl, in our case, dies, IHT, inheritance tax, death taxes, are held over. So they remain above your head, but in return you open to the public. So many of the great houses, such as Blenheim or Burley, were under the same regime. So there's the deal. We are in partnership with HMRC and Historic England. So that, I think, is really good, which doesn't happen in other countries. It was a very good piece of legislation. We were deemed of national importance when the 6th Earl died in 87, and that's what my husband and his father achieved. So it's not just the house. We've got a medieval barn from 1438. There are follies, there's Bronze Age, Iron Age, and the 5th Earl is buried in the middle of an Iron Age fort, which dates back to the same time as the civilization of Tutankhamun. So it's an extraordinary estate as a record of how we've lived. So that's why we're still there. Before that, before 1987, every so often, Geordie's grandfather sold things to make ends meet. He survived 2 world wars, and I'm in no way trying to criticize him, so please forgive that. The men who did that, he was born in 1898, and he saw more horrors than I hope we have to see today. But I'm not sure how much we learn or not. But he lived through that. Income tax in 1914 was 6%. In 1918, it was 60%. And our debt to America in that war increased tenfold. So we started, there were a few things, mainly estates at that time, which the 5th Earl had to sell to keep paying super tax. After World War II, it was again a different regime with a socialist government coming to power and the NHS starting off, and again a time of higher taxes. So in order again to survive, there was a few lucky breaks, but different paintings were sold. So that happened in every house. It is, for my personal remit and with Historic England, is not ever to sell anything else again. And if things get tight, I'm not interested in doing that. There's other ways around it, because the collection, such as it is obviously a little bit thinner than it was, although it's not half bad. But it's actually the diversity of the collection, from the different wall hangings to the embroideries, to the paintings, to the brown furniture, to the silver. It's the whole history of collecting in this country full of stately homes. So that's my remit, is not to have to sell anything and to actually buy the odd thing back where we can. So that's how I feel about it. And I think, again, the capital of this country, you shouldn't diminish. It's obviously being diminished at the moment, unbelievably. It's very hard to get back capital. We're all earning money and trying to have enough to buy something we like, whether it's a holiday or a work of art. It's bloody difficult. So just don't put yourself in an even worse position. So it's quite interesting, collector and masterpieces, but culture, what we've created, what matters to us, the values that it incorporates when you look at something, is unbelievably important. And we need to preserve it. Thank you. Any questions about Downton Abbey?
Any further questions?
I hope I can word this in a good way, but is there anything of the Rothschilds' Jewish ancestry that has arrived, or Jewish heritage that's remained within the collections through
I mean, I don't know. I never think of it as what was either Jewish or not, and I'm not sure they did either. I think it's about what they saw and they chose to collect. I don't see it's Jewish or Catholic or Christian or Egyptian. It's the works of art that reflects the culture of where we've come from, and it's all put together so that different things appeal to different people. We have got some very nice Meissen china, which I think remains from Alfred de Rothschild's. Almina gave a couple of beautiful pieces of furniture, sofas, back to Versailles, which was quite annoying. All they're sitting there, maybe they weren't from the start with. Every so often you do find things, well, I didn't quite like them actually in the drawing room. They'd been quite interesting today to show to people. But anyway, I have to say, oh, lovely. I hope you're grateful. But anyway, so there's things like that. You have moments of very human weakness. That's just another one of them. But I don't think in those terms at all. And I've done a lot of research into Alfred Rothschild for the latest book. I have found him fascinating, both the most extraordinary collector, the most kindest and most generous man to those in need in an extraordinary fashion. Every Christmas, he and his brothers used to make sure that every bus driver and every taxi driver in London had pheasant and rabbits and food as gifts from them. They must have given away thousands. He gave everybody who worked on his estate bowls of hot soup at lunchtime. I mean, extraordinary men in so many ways, in what they shared as well as what they accumulated. And yet they parted well, and he drove zebras for fun around Hyde Park. So partying is also important. That's the music of life. He had his own orchestra. He conducted them with a diamond-encrusted battle. So I love these sides, which is all of us, and they're all important.
Any final questions?
Hiya. So you touched on the importance of Howard Carter's discovery in 1922 of Tutankhamun's
Lord
tomb.
Carnarvon and Howard Carter's discovery.
Quite.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Yes, indeed. How much of an impact do you think the Egyptians had on modern art today, as they were very into that art themselves?
I think after the discovery in 1922, there was a huge consequential legacy which they gave us in terms of the Art Deco movements, which is really interesting. I finished writing my book at that point in time, but it is an incredibly important civilization. It lasted, perhaps in those times, it was more obviously in fashion and architecture and art. In today's world, when I'm starting to write, I think of the legacy of that civilization in that they existed for at least 5,000 words. I've taught myself quite a lot of Egyptian language through Alan Gardner's Middle High Egyptian grammar book. He was a frequent visitor at Highclere as well. But the legacy of the Egyptians actually is broader than that today. They survived 5,000 years. They looked after and nurtured the land in which they lived. Yes, there were wars, there was slavery, there was good and bad things, we're equally guilty. We are 2,000 years post-Christ and past their civilization, and we're destroying, not nurturing our world. So I'm interested in thinking about their appreciation for the cycle of each day, the cycle of each season, their knowledge of the Nile and the flooding, and then our desire to control rather than work with and collaborate with the world. So I'm now interpreting their legacy in a slightly different way in terms of the environment and the beauty of the world, which certainly appealed to Lord Carnarvon. And the other small point to make is perhaps that Lord Carnarvon was much liked by the local Egyptians. He provided employment, he paid them all well, and he welcomed all the founding fathers of Egypt back to Highclere to find those points of collaboration. So whenever I'm looking at things, there are so many points of fragility, brittleness, and anger in this world. I'm trying to find the common threads, whether through time or space or people, that those are the positive things that we must remember to try and bring us back together again. And I've been lucky, and one of my most exciting moments was when I opened the visitor's book to find Saad Zaghloul and Ali Yekin and all these founding fathers of Egypt had also stayed at Highclere, as had Howard Carter, Disraeli, Salisbury, Queen Caroline, the Prince of Wales. They were also there. So it's bringing people back together. So there's one level of his influence straight after. There's another level which I wish to bring back in terms of his Lord Carnarvon's welcoming of all aspects of Egypt into his life, and then how we need to look at the environment going forwards, which they did far better than we're doing. And if we all disappear, who the hell is going to miss our bloody mobile phones? But they might miss the pyramids from outer space.
Well, this is a very good point. Actually, if I could dip in on that as well, beyond the immediate influence on Art Deco and on architectural and design styles, in the early 20th century, there's also the really fascinating filmic influence that, again, obviously, Carter and Carnarvon's discovery comes about 8 years before the invention of sound, of sound motion pictures. But it's interesting to note that when that technology is invented, one of the first international blockbuster films is, of course, Boris Karloff's The Mummy, that actually explicitly references the 1922 expedition.
But if I could just interrupt, in January 1923, in the first 2 weeks of January, Lord Carnarvon was in London seeing Pathé Ciné, trying to sell film rights. He was also seeing another French company as well, trying to get the best deal, and he wanted to write a book. So I finished The Earl and the Pharaoh, saying, I've written the book that he was never able to write, and maybe there'll be a film from it yet.
You won.
So that was
that's very important.
so,
This is for the record. Actually, this is a very important point to make. Yes, I quite agree. But even in more contemporary terms, it's great for us to talk about the early 20th century, and very apt. But there's also the incredible influence that maybe whether or not quote unquote authentic ancient Egyptian visual culture, who knows? But what our perception of it is has a tremendous influence in the architecture and style and design of the 1980s
Louvre.
as well. Quite.
Yeah.
This is it. I mean, whether it be I Am Pei at the Louvre or the postmodernism of the aptly named Memphis group. That there's this thing that I find endlessly fascinating about the legacy of ancient Egyptian visual culture, which is really brought to the world, through your family, is that it keeps popping up again and again in these variety of different contexts, whether it be through the pre-1922 Vogue, the kind of post-Napoleon, post-1798 Vogue, through the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, or through the music hall traditions of the later 19th century, or the work of David Roberts, the Scottish artist who I know quite well, or Art Deco, or the postmodernism of the Memphis group, that it keeps popping up and up again, or even in the music videos of contemporary recording artists like MIA that make use of ancient Egyptian mythology in their visual culture, that there's something that's like, for whatever reason, and I'm not smart enough to know why, but I just know that it exists, that there is something about that culture that captivates us.
Secrets and treasures. I think we're all on a path to find secrets and treasures. I mean, that's why I watched Indiana Jones and the Raiders of the Lost Ark. And in some ways, Earl of Carnarvon had a wonderful hat with a lucky white band. And, he liked driving fast, and he was, the Geoffrey de Havilland, who's one of the earliest aviation pioneers, took off from Highclere in 1910. So he was so interested in all the earliest technologies and fascinated by the past, a restless, inquisitive man. And I think that's what we all should be. There's a very good poem by George Herbert, because our family name is Herbert, but the title is Carnarvon. And I hope he's a distant relative, because I'm rather fond of him. And it's called The Pulley, and it starts, when God at first made man, having a glass of blessing standing by. Let us, said he, pour in him all we can, strength, beauty, everything made away. But the poem then comes to a resolution, saying, but alone of all his blessings, rest in the bottom lay, so that if goodness doesn't throw us to God's breast, then weariness may. And I think in some ways that perpetual motion was definitely in Lord Carnarvon. He was a Christian, he was buried, and that mattered to him when he went to church, but he was a man who, hopefully in the end, I think weariness threw him to his rest.
Lady Carnarvon, thank you so much.
Pleasure.
Again, it's been an absolute joy to hang out with you. I'm sure you guys have all enjoyed as well. And thank you all so much, everyone. Cheers.
Thank you. Thank you very much.